Hello, my name is Jeremy Barker, and I serve as the director of the Middle East Action Team for the Religious Freedom Institute. Thank you for joining us today for this event looking at the situation in Sudan. Where is it headed and where is it going? Um, we recognize this is a timely event as the conditions in Sudan continue to unfold for RFI. We've been looking over the last number of months at Sudan as a case with a number of positive developments, and then certainly over the last few weeks we've seen challenges and concerns with a military coup and a rupture in what seemed to be the potential for democratic progress. And so joining us today, we have a phenomenal lineup of speakers to help us make sense of both the current situation in Sudan, as well as where things were and we hope where they might be going. So allow me to introduce our speakers today. We have joining us Mr. Ismail Kushkush, a independent journalist based in the Washington, D.C. area who's been previously based in Sudan, written for The Atlantic, New York Times, and others. A very experienced voice on Sudan, and privileged to have him joining us. In addition, we have Mr. Mohi Omer, a policy analyst at the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, past work at the National Endowment for Democracy and or NDI, working on governance and leadership in Africa, and currently covering Sudan and Iraq for the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, as well as Professor A.J. Nolte, Assistant Professor of Politics at Regent University, at Regent's Robertson School of Government, as well as the lead author for a recent report from the Religious Freedom Institute looking at religious freedom changes in Sudan. We also hope to have joining us as well Miriam Ibrahim, the Director of Global Mobilization and a co-founder at the Tahrir al-Nisa Foundation. Hope to have Miriam join us shortly. So Ismail, Mohi, AJ, thank you so much for joining us to talk about Sudan. Ismail, I wanted to start with you as we'll go backward in a little bit, but want you to set the scene somewhat for where things are today in Sudan from October 25th to nationwide protest, particularly looking at what happened on October 31st, protest across the country, to where we are today. So it's a big question, but please help us to get a feel for the context of where we are today.
Yeah, so on the morning of October 25th, Sudanese in the world woke up to the news of the arrests of many civilian members of the transitional government, ministers and political figures, what seemed to indicate that this was a coup in the making. Later in the day, General Burhan, the head of the transitional government, the head of the Sovereignty Council, made a statement on Sudanese television stating that they were in the process, quote unquote, of correcting the path of the revolution. And the world understood this clearly, that this was a coup. The term coup has been debated, whether it's a coup or not, what kind of legal obligations would the word entail. But for all practical purposes, that we saw the military, in essence, go back on its agreement, the partnership agreement that it had with a group of civilians to help transition Sudan into full civilian rule. This was on October 25th. That act was met by international condemnation from the United States, from the United Nations, from the European Union. Sudan's membership in the African Union has been suspended. We saw the United States freeze its assistance of $700 million to Sudan. We saw the World Bank also freeze its operations in Sudan, its assistance to Sudan, as well as the European Union and Germany and other donors. This was met, I think, more importantly, by a huge reaction from the Sudanese street. Um, we saw large protests on October the 31st, in Khartoum and in many cities in different parts of Sudan, in the center, north, east, west, and southern parts of the country, demanding the reinstatement of the civilian side of the government. The house arrest of Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok and the detainment of a number of the civilian ministers, continues. What we are seeing now is negotiations between different intermediaries between the military and between the civilian side, in hopes of reaching some sort of either return to the status of on October 24th, the day before the military's action, before the day before the coup, um, uh, and whether or not Sudanese, the majority of Sudanese will accept that. I mean, I think that is also will be a question. The idea that the military would at some point intervene to protect its own interests, to fend off the possibility of accountability, was always a question in the minds of Sudanese since the fall of Omar al-Bashir in April 2019. The worst case scenario for most Sudanese came true on October 25th. To see that type of military intervention. Where the country goes, I think, is a big question mark at the moment. But this definitely has put a dent on the hopes of transition into a democracy for most Sudanese.
Thank you. Yeah, that is a number of events to have uncovered, and as you rightly so, there were positive steps that have been taken since April 2019 and the removal of President Bashir, and so many of those investments that you rightly pointed out that have been frozen pending what happened. Those were the results of what looked to be really positive steps toward in the right direction for Sudan. I want to. I saw Miriam join. Miriam, are you able to join on camera? Great. Very good. Thank you so much for joining today. I wanted to turn to you next to follow up on Ismail's kind of setting of the scene of what's been happening over the last 2 weeks, and wanted to hear from you, kind of your own personal connections of what you've been hearing from across Sudan as you watch the events unfolding since the 25th of October.
Right. Thank you for having me with you today. So this is very challenging time for people in Sudan, really, and it's upsetting. Actually, we start having some hope that's changing, coming the way. But I think it will go. Now the world have better view that we no longer have to trust the military leader anymore, and they actually made a huge mistake by underestimating the power of the people on the street, and they have seen this happen in 2019 when al-Bashir finally Bashir's regime is over. This is all happened, and because the voice of people, on the power of the people in the street, their voice, and but I am very concerned about certain things, especially we start seeing assassination attempt against some individuals who work with the government, civilian leaders, work with part of the transitional government. This is very concerning. The other thing, I think we needed to listen to what the people on the street wanted. The people want civilian-led government. So this is very clear. It has been said in 2019, and it's continuing actually the call for civilian-led government. This is a chance for whatever happened these past 2 years to be corrected now at this moment and at this time. So for women and for children and for religious minorities, it's very important to have clear picture whether we have religious freedom, whether we have civilian-led government or not. Because during al-Bashir regime, it's very hard for religious minority and for press and for free speech. It's very challenging. It was being very challenging time. So people start seeing hope this past 2 years, even though we are far away from being perfect, but there's some hope that change might happen.
Yeah.
And yeah.
And I think you're right that call for civilian government. I know if you watch the videos that we're able to get out on social media from the demonstrations on October 31st and really since the 25th, you've heard that refrain over and over again that the people want a civilian government. And Ibrahim or Miriam, you mentioned a couple of times that there was a sense of hope that was building, and we do want to take a little bit of a step back to look at those past 2 years and what the context has been since the removal of President Bashir, a movement toward transitionally and tentatively towards civilian government, and there were improvements on protection of and respect for women's rights, religious minorities, and others. Mohe, from your work at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, monitoring these dynamics, reporting on them, I know this is something you've looked at closely. Would you, how would you set the scene of what were the reasons for that hope over the last 2 years?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jeremy. It's great to be here today. Let me just begin quickly by sharing with you our reporting on Sudan, and then highlight the advances that the Sudanese government had made since August of 2019. So for 19 years, we have recommended to the State Department to designate Sudan as a country of particular concern for engaging in systematic, ongoing, and egregious religious freedom violations. Due to the progress the transitional government had made in 2020, we recommended to the State Department to upgrade Sudan to the special watch list. And in 2021, as of this year, we recommended to the State Department to remove Sudan altogether from the list because of the progress that the transitional government has been making. So just to highlight quickly what kind of specific reforms the Sudanese government has taken to advance religious freedom, right after assuming office in August of 2019, in December of 2019, the transitional government repealed the oppressive public order law, which the previous government used to punish individuals who did not conform to the strict interpretation of Sunni Islam of the al-Bashir regime. And in July of 2020, we saw the transitional government pass the historic The Rights and Freedoms Act, which is basically repealed the apostasy law, ended flogging, banned female genital mutilation, permitted non-Muslims to drink alcohol, and abolished the guardianship law, which required women to get a permit from a male guardianship when they're traveling abroad with their own kids. And also following that, the government designated December 25th as a national holiday so that the Christian citizens of Sudan could celebrate Christmas. And in May of 2020, we saw that the transitional government also issued a decree disbanding the former regime's appointed Church of Councils, which the previous regime used to justify oppression of the Christian community in Sudan. And we also saw that the Minister of Religious Affairs in Sudan called on the minorities who left Sudan, including Jews, to return to Sudan because the government was willing to provide protection and respects their right to practice their faith. So we've seen the government was really working towards enhancing religious freedom of all Sudanese people. And not only that, but also the transitional government was willing to engage with Yusuf and the broader US government. In November of 2020, we organized an event where we had the Prime Minister, we had the Minister of Religious Affairs and other government officials participated to highlight the progress that the government had made. And also in May of this year, we organized another event where the Minister of Religious Affairs was in Washington, D.C., and he participated in that event as well. And also the Prime Minister visited us at Yusuf in our building in 2020, and also we were able to make a trip to Sudan in 2020, in February of 2020, to assess religious freedom conditions on the ground. So what we have seen over the last 2 years is that progress towards advancing human rights, including religious freedom, and the government's willingness to engage with the international community, including Yusuf, and they are willing to engage those who they agree with or disagree with. We have seen that. However, with the recent change, all of this progress could be jeopardized, and that's a huge concern for us. We continue to monitor the situation closely to see how it's going to evolve over the next few weeks and few months and into the future.
Thank you. I think that's a really good rundown of a number of those steps that were taken, and particularly on the government side of and that willingness to engage was important, and there was fruit that came from that on the U.S. side, the removal from the state sponsor of terrorism list, as you acknowledged on the religious freedom coming off the country of particular concern list. And we mentioned earlier economic investment. Much of that came kind of top down. I wanted to turn to AJ, and you were the lead author for us on this recent report from RFI that was certainly taking into account these kind of top down changes, but really speaking with Sudanese in the country, observers, those who have worked on religious freedom issues over a number of years, and kind of what was the perspective from the bottom up, and what were some of the key trends that came out of that report, the factors that you were looking at. So bring us into a little bit of the observations from that report that was finalized just days ahead of October 25th.
Sure, thanks, Jeremy. Appreciate that. So what we essentially did when we decided we were going to do this was we wanted to get a set of interviews from a broad spectrum of folks who were very closely connected with and involved with religious freedom developments in Sudan. Everyone from local observers in Sudan, international religious freedom activists, both Sudanese and international, as well as people who are sort of more plugged into some of the political developments. And we also had some folks from U.S. government backgrounds who worked on those issues as well. In general, what we found was that there was significant progress, as Moi and the Yusuf reporting demonstrated. There were significant progress in terms of legal changes. That was felt by people on the ground as well. They noticed that and they saw the impact of that. There were still some tensions over lingering social hostilities. What was really interesting, I would say, and one of the key trends that, in fact, if you read the report, and you can see from there, we do most of our interviews from February through April, and early drafting in sort of May, and then of course go through a longer process. But what you'll see there is even as far back as April, we had some people that we interviewed, and there's quotes from that in the case study talking about something like what happened on October 25th as a very real possibility, if not a likely possibility. And so what was fascinating was the sensitivity of the folks in Sudan, some of the local Sudanese observers, to some of the internal dynamics, both within the civilian side, but particularly within the military. And so I'll, just highlight one of the things that I thought was really interesting that a couple of our observers emphasized were the factions within the Sudanese military between the Rapid Support Forces, Burhan himself, and factions that were maybe more Bashir loyalists, and some of the outside backing from regional actors. That was something that people in Sudan thought was very significant. Some of the external, sort of activist folks, maybe from more of a international background, weren't picking up on some of those dynamics. So that was something that we thought was very interesting. Key, and this is not surprising, but one of the key things that the two things that everybody focused on as two of the most important things to make the gain sustainable, because we wanted to not only look at what happened, but how do we maintain that positive direction. The two most important things that people emphasized were, number one, keeping the Islamists from coming back into power. And two, related to this but distinct, the idea of security sector reform. One person said, if you get things right in the military, if you have a military that reflects the ethnic and religious pluralism of Sudan, then you will prevent a military coup and preserve religious freedom in Sudan for the next 50 years. That was probably the single quote that stuck with me the most. Pursuant to that, something that I want to highlight sort of as I close, some of the top line past takeaways, something that happened even as we were working on the report was the signing of the Declaration of Principles between Abdelaziz al-Hilu of the SPLM North, originally Prime Minister Hamdok, and then subsequently Burhan did sign two key provisions of that declaration that are really important. One is a guarantee that these folks signed on to of a separation of religion from the state. It's very carefully worded because some of the terms can be a little bit loaded in some of the Sudanese religious contexts, but it is there. And then second was this promise that there was going to be an integration of various different rebel groups and other groups into the military so that the religious and ethnic diversity of Sudan would be reflected in the military. And so, that combined with, I would say, some of the internal tensions in the military itself, those things were things that sort of we picked up on as, okay, if things go badly, it's going to be because the declaration gets pushed to the side and because of some of the very intense, complex dynamics within the Sudanese military, leading to a coup such as the one that we just saw. And so the most important dynamic is, in fact, or one of the recommendations, and I'll talk about this maybe a little bit later, is a really, really important integration of various different groups into the military, security sector reform, and having a military that culturally and institutionally reflects the religious pluralism of Sudan. And I would say that probably I would stand behind the recommendations of that report and some of our conclusions as well, even given what happened on the 25th.
Thank you. And I think we'll dive into a little bit of that, including the role of regional actors, international actors, in just a moment. But Miriam, would like to hear from you as you think back to these last 2 years since 2019, and your own experience having witnessed and felt some of the most brutal of the violations of religious freedom. And as you look at these last 2 years and the gains that were made, but also the needs still, the changes still that needed to be worked on. What's your view to how things were going? And then in a moment we'll turn to where they may be headed next. But how do you see the last 2 years in Sudan and the progress that was being made?
Well, as I said, we have started seeing some sort of hope, but there's a lot of mistake being made based to that hope and promises we hear from the Prime Minister, from his cabinet, in issues related to religious freedom and human rights. There's some rush and decision made based to just certain statements, including change in law. There's too many small details behind that for as Mohit said, yes, this change happened with apostasy law and with drinking alcohol and these laws and public law order. But let me tell you, in Sudan we have a problem, and which is we are still under Sharia law. For this, we have one place that is kind of reference to the court and to even to the government, which is Islamic Fiqh Academy. In any court case, the court send the case to them to provide reference for how can the case, be resolved. So this is really very concerning, and this is a big problem, because in this situation, you can have a constitution. Sudan have violated, in many cases, including mine, Sudan have violated their own constitution. Back in legal details, in small legal details. I'm not an expert on that, but I will say this is from my experience and from other cases. We have, even now, we haven't heard any discussion from the Hamdouk or his cabinet in issue related to church lands or justice for people who lost their life on the street, justice for people of Darfur and Nuba Mountains. We haven't heard any discussion on these issues. They never confronted their fellow or leaders that shared the same cabinet with them. Even their military, we know this is what happened in the street during the protest. There's no discussion about justice. Even when they sign peace agreements with other rebels or other, there's no discussion for peace or justice for those people. And when people walk out in the street, they're called for peace, justice, and freedom. And without peace, without justice, we cannot have peace or have freedom. That's how we end up now in this situation. So, and in many cases, we hear people saying the fragile government. It's coming the name, transitional fragile government. And yet we have put so much trust on them to be able to remove Sudan from the country of particular concern, even though we have many laws that are, it's really concerning to me personally as a woman and as a mother. And I can say example, yes, we have this, they removed apostasy law, Polish apostasy law, but when the Minister of Justice started a committee to establish the new law, one of my lawyers have been selected to join the committee. He resigned the next day because the way they putting everything wasn't really honest thing to do. So, and our commitment is for freedom, religious freedom, and human rights respect for everybody, for everyone in Sudan. When we came to drinking alcohol, when I'm in prison, most of women who came in by this crime are Muslim women. And most of them are from Darfur and Nuba Mountains, this conflict zone and conflict area. They lost their spouses, and making alcohol is the only way they can provide for their family. So now we have favored Christian by allowing them to drink alcohol, but we punish Muslims without looking to who's exactly make this. Drinking alcohol is a personal choice. It's not have nothing to do with crime. It's a personal choice. So when I look at the situation, like those women, you said you have religious freedom, but if you have a Muslim woman or Muslim man drink alcohol, or a Muslim woman made alcohol to be able to provide for her family, she end up in jail. And when she go there, she be questioned, what is your religion? That's not what religious freedom stands for. The other thing, we have a lot of issues with family law, and my case actually is not a conversion. My case is back to family and personal status law. And I would say this clear. When my son grew up and he decided to go back to Sudan and fell in love with a Muslim girl in Sudan, and they want to marry, he will have a problem because Muslim is still, this still law doesn't apply. Muslim girls cannot marry to Christian man. This is applied. And she cannot do that without her family permission. Yes, they can travel without family, but they cannot marry without family's permission. So here is the problem. with that. When this happened, they both gonna be faced, either you have to give up your religion to be able to marry her, or she have to be, because she can convert. Apostasy law is she can convert. That's not. I don't think it's really been stated well, and I don't. It's what I see in this case. The transitional government, even the civilian leader, all they care as the same as the al-Bashir regime does. They care how the international community and how the world outside see them. So they are willing to do whatever it takes to make sure they have a beautiful picture outside. As one of my friends said, when we go and visit Sudan, the leader will tell us, oh, the reality is different than the image. Come and see the reality. Here we are. We are beautiful and we're perfect. Sudan is a beautiful country and is not a poor country, not just with economic, but is very rich with very high educated and talented citizens and individuals and men and women. So I don't think we are it might be this sort of hope, but it's not for us to trust so much in that fragile government to be able to protect the individual. Now Hamdok himself needed to be rescued, because when you do not stand up for justice for others, and when you do not discuss there's some very uncomfortable conversations he needed to have with the military leader, and he have that opportunity, and he have all the support from people in Sudan, from international community. But he never done that. And we have sent a letter asking the Treasury Department to issue a global magnitude sanction against Hamiti and al-Burhan and those individuals, because they are wanted by ISIS. Hamdok is stand in the middle, and he said, no, we are one, and we want to work together as a Sudanese brother, and we want to make sure our country moving forward to better. So, I mean, it's really hard to explain how we feel about this, because when you know how things will end up in this direction and you said the truth, I can see how the lobbying work and have very huge impact in any decision being made for international community, including what happened at the Human Rights Council last month. So everybody's pulling his hand out of Sudan, and we trust this fragile government to take care of its people and to make sure that, I don't know how to explain this.
Yeah.
As I said, I'm not an expert, but from my experience, there's some kind of rush making decision in this situation. And I hope that we be able to see that clear now, and we can have a better view of exactly how things will move forward. It's challenging time for the civilian, and it's challenging time for Hamdok himself. But
and I want to pick up on that and maybe go back to Mohi before we move on. And you talked about some of the high-level engagement that happened in Washington with visits from Minister of Religious Affairs, from the Prime Minister, and as both Miriam and AJ pointed to, there is kind of positive high-level steps made, but that the feeling of justice reaching to the people on the street and changes there, kind of how did those conversations go of knowing these are positive steps, but there's more to be done? Can you give us any insight into kind of what that engagement looked like, whether in public or behind closed doors in some of those conversations?
Yeah, for sure. So during our engagement, whether we were in Khartoum or the Prime Minister and his ministers, actually the Minister of Justice, the Minister of Religious Affairs, well, we met with all of them when they were here in Washington, D.C. Also, we met with them when we were in Sudan. They have shared their commitment to continue to make progress in advancing human rights issues. It was a challenge, right? That a government, it's a hybrid government between the military and the civilians, came to power and trying to dismantle institutions that are put in place by the former regime, and they were instilled for 30 years, right? That's just not an easy thing to do within a day or a year. It takes a long time to do. And also, in addition to that, the process in itself has to go through. It begins within the councils of ministers, and then it goes into the sovereign council to approve it. And one fear that could, one fear or one concern that one may raise is the fact that there is no legislative body that create these laws and make them into permanent laws. So I mean, whether it's behind closed doors or the public events we have with them, they have always been very frank that they have been working on dismantling some of these restrictive laws, and at the same time, they recognize that there were some issues. For example, they repealed the apostasy law, right? But still, they were not able to repeal the blasphemy law, even though they have modified that law to drop flogging, under that law. So they recognize the complexity of the issues. However, they seem to be committed to continuing to basically work towards improving the rights of all Sudanese people. So we continue to monitor the situation. Again, we continue to encourage them. We continue to highlight the specific areas of improvement when it comes to religious freedom and human rights issues in general, because the two are really hard to separate at times. So we continue to engage with them as to basically what we would focus on going forward now that the government is dissolved and the military is in full control. I think we will continue to monitor the situation and see what it will yield into. And there is a discussion that there will be a government, and hopefully that government would be committed to continuing basically to improve religious freedom issues in the country. And also we're working with our colleagues in the US government in different departments, the State Department and other implementers in Washington, D.C., who are working on human rights issues to make sure that we're all coordinating on specific areas of concerns, as well as how we can coordinate our efforts to encourage the new coming government to continue to kind of uphold them responsible and to continue to improve religious freedom issues in Sudan.
Yeah, very good. And we may come back to a bit more on that. AJ, you'd wanted to mention something as you look at the last 2 years with regards to Hamdok and a point from the research.
Yeah, so thanks, Jeremy. Just very briefly, I also wanted to say, I think Miriam makes an excellent point about Sharia. In particular, one of the concerns that folks had was that while the government was maybe talking about even putting a civil code at the national level, one of the things that even some of the rebel groups were sympathetic to, not all, and certainly not the SPLM, but there was some talk about things like, well, we could allow for Sharia courts at a regional level. Looking at some of the other cases that I've studied where that type of thing has been implemented, where you only allow for Sharia at a regional level, you do still see a lot of religious freedom violations come out of that. So I know for some of the groups, particularly for Abdulaziz al-Hilu, from some of the folks we were talking to who are close to him, that's an absolute red line for at least some of the rebel groups. On Hamdok, just a quick point here on this. One of the things that we did with key actors in the study was we assessed people's favorability, unfavorability, and perception of effectiveness. And generally speaking, without getting into the nitty-gritty and the stats and things of what we found, the general perception people had of Hamdok was that he was the commitment was genuine, his heart was in the right place, but there were concerns about how effective he was going to be, and from a variety of different reasons. Some people said, kind of what you heard from Miriam, which is that maybe his heart is in the right place, or there's a genuine commitment, but he's weak. He's not pushing hard enough. He has not been a very strong leader. Others said he seems like he's genuinely committed, but we're not sure how much power and authority he actually has to push for things, and we're not sure whether he's really the one who's calling the shots. And so those were both sort of things that we heard coming out of this. Now, what's interesting about what some of the things you've heard since the coup about, possibly a negotiated settlement where Hamdok would come back, if in fact he was holding back because he was nervous about something like a coup happening in the future, that's already happened at this point. So it'll be really interesting to see if he comes back. Does he take a more aggressive line? If one of the reasons for the coup, as I suspect, is that the folks in the military are trying to get immunity and prevent some of the justice and the reckoning that Miriam has been talking about. If the coup, in a sense, fails, or if there's sort of a reversion to partial or complete civilian rule, it seems like they may have actually pushed things in the opposite direction. So that's something to watch, and also what kind of requests are they going to make in terms of things like immunity, etc. Is that part of the deal that the military is trying to negotiate for behind closed doors? So those are all, I think, things for us to be watching over the next couple weeks and months.
Very, very interesting. Good points to raise. Ismail, would like to come back to you as we start to look at where to go from here. Certainly hearing this as we look at the last 2 years, so much unfinished business of progress to be made, as well as what do we do, and what do you see coming? So I'd love to hear your assessment of that, as well as beginning to move toward recommendations. What ought people, whether the international community, engaged civil society actors, the Sudanese people themselves, kind of where would you begin to go with recommendations?
Well, I think the military may have been somewhat caught off guard by the massive response to its action, whether internationally or even locally in Sudan. Locally in Sudan, I mean, even before the October 25th, the failed coup attempts weeks before was met by large protests in the streets in Sudan. I mean, it's somewhat interesting that you had large protests not only in reaction to the failed coup attempts, but to the possibility of what many people thought would be a coming coup. The massive protests on October 21st, on the anniversary of the October Revolution of 1964, the very first massive popular uprising in the region that brought down a military government, I thought was very indicative of what the mood in the street was, and may have caught the military somewhat by surprise. That despite a pandemic, that despite the dire economic situation, despite the legitimate criticisms that many people have of the transitional government, still the very idea of a transition into a civilian-led democracy, I think, is the prize that most Sudanese are eager to see happen, despite whatever promises that the military may have to offer. So this idea that that the majority of Sudanese will accept the current status, I think, is unrealistic. What we are seeing right now, and what is expected, is to see negotiations between through different intermediaries to come to some sort of agreement between civilians and the military on either to return to the days, October 24th, or to come up with some sort of new agreement. But more importantly, I think it is the street. I think most Sudanese are now even more distrustful of the intentions. I think of the military. Where this goes, I think we'll be seeing in the coming days of where this will be leading to. But the most important thing, I think, for international observers and again for most Sudanese, is the commitment to the idea of transferring Sudan into a democracy. Whatever the issues are, unless Sudan becomes truly a civilian-led democracy, I don't think you can discuss. You cannot frankly discuss, and you cannot come to real solutions to any of the issues that the country faces, be it social, be it economic, be it political. That prize of transferring Sudan into a democracy, I think is the key issue. The concern that I have is that with the military in power and the promises that it may seek to give to different players, even locally or even internationally and regionally, would only be a partial solutions, patching of the issues. The fact is, the idea of transferring Sudan into a democracy after 30 years, 3 decades of authoritarian rule, of up and down um, um, experiences since independence in 1956, I think this is not an easy route. This is not something that easy. But I mean, I think what the 2019 revolution, one of the most important slogans in my mind, is that use the Arabic expression "Dithorat Wa'i." This is a revolution of consciousness. I think more than any time in Sudan's modern history, we've seen at a massive public level the frank and discussion of the country's problems, the frank attempts to come to real solutions, with all the hindrances and with all the obstacles that are in the way and the politics behind that, whether domestically in Sudan or by regional players. I think the idea is to keep the prize is transferring Sudan into a democracy, and unless that happens, and again, that is in itself is a process. Um, no issue can truly be. We will find no real solutions to Sudan's problems.
Yeah, I think that has a lot of great insight in there, and that challenge of transferring those ideas into the institutions necessary to maintain them, and consolidating that. But thank you. And Mohi, you started toward this a moment ago, but perhaps as a DC-based advising on policy recommendations, we can use the U.S. first as an example, but other international actors as well. The Biden administration has talked about religious freedom at the center of its foreign policy engagement. What does that look like in practice in Sudan now, as we think about engagement and the challenges around freezing certain levels of assets, but also wanting to maintain engaged? Where would you begin to go at key indicators that you're looking at, both inside Sudan, regionally, internationally, and how that begins to inform the policy steps that the U.S. or others might take?
Yeah, sure. In terms of the indicators in general that we're going to look into in the coming, few days and weeks, is again the incoming government, the new government. The military has declared its intention to form a government of technocrats. We don't know if that would happen, but we will look into that, and we will look into the commitment of the incoming government to advance human rights issues. That's one area that we're going to closely monitor. And at the same time, we continue to work with our colleagues in Washington, D.C. to make sure that religious freedom and human rights issues in general are, center and front in terms of engaging with regional actors and in terms of engaging with the Sudanese government. So that's one aspect of it. In terms of basically programmatic engagement with our colleagues in Washington, D.C., as you saw in our Sudan policy update we just put out last year, we highlighted specific areas of engagement for the U.S. government to consider. For example, increasing funding for curriculum reform in Sudan. And this came when we met with the Prime Minister as well as the Minister of Religious Affairs. They all, and the Minister of Education, they have indicated their willingness to change the former curricula that put together by the former regime, and it was intolerance of religious freedom. They wanted to move away from that by producing a new curriculum that is very inclusive and reflective of the Sudanese people. We were supporting that efforts, and we encouraged the U.S. government to support that efforts, and USAID has actually allocated funding for that. So those are the areas that we continue to engage now that the funding has been frozen, and the U.S. government has, froze all of its assistance to Sudan. I'm sure that is also part of it, right? Again, that would depend on the incoming government and how that could be perceived. In terms of legal reforms, we have also highlighted specific areas, as the Minister of Justice said that his government, the previous Minister of Justice, his government was committed to carrying out legal reforms that advance human rights and religious freedom issues. And we have recommended to the U.S. government, the State Department, USAID, to continue to provide technical and financial assistance to the Sudanese government to carry that out. And again, that in itself is also frozen. So we will continue. Again, it all, I think, depends on what would happen in the next few weeks and a few months and into the future. If a new government that comes to power, which is committed to advancing these values that we care about, then we would continue to recommend for the U.S. government to continue to provide the assistance they need to carry out these reforms. And if the opposite happened, we're ready to replace Sudan, recommend to the State Department to consider other actions. I know that's into the future, but these are basically the possibilities that are out there. It's hard to kind of nail down what specifically we will do, given that everything is up in the air right now and we have no idea what would unfold. And I agree with actually my colleague Ismail when he said that the military is making it clear that it wanted to hang into power, but the Sudanese people had spoken, and it is, I think, naive, and it's not a good analysis to encourage the military to hang on to power by itself, because that's just not feasible given everything that we see in the country, in the region, and around the world. And finally, I would say that we're encouraged by the administration moves to make sure that civilian government is restored and make sure that these gains are in place, and we're not going to engage with the military if they are going to jeopardize all of the gains that made in the last 2 years.
Very good. Yeah. Speaking of those gains, I want to turn to AJ. Part of the goal of the report was to identify steps that could be taken to consolidate gains that those religious freedom work of religious freedom advocates or others, that those don't amount to kind of window dressing type changes, but they get to the heart of issues. So both from the research as well as your own work, what do you see as key next steps for those concerned with religious freedom, both Sudan in particular, but can even speak more broadly as well, based on the research?
Yeah, so I want to say, first of all, I agree with both what Moe and Ismail have said about this gambit by the military of the coup is not going to work. It's a little bit puzzling that they thought it was going to work in the first place. I mean, to a certain extent, you can understand it. That is sort of the playbook that goes way before the Bashir regime. As I think Ismail may have alluded to, you had a military coup by Aboud in the 60s. You had, of course, Numeri, his coup followed by a period of democracy, followed by another coup. So there is sort of this historical pattern that people that are coming up in the Sudanese military culture would be familiar with. Of there's this brief, somewhat chaotic period of democracy, and then eventually we get to take over again. But the ground has shifted. The military itself is factionalized and is not united. Just because they all, maybe want immunity and don't want to be prosecuted doesn't mean that they like each other. And it's so much easier now for the civilians to mobilize, to get to the streets. Social media has been a tool of mobilization. I think sometimes we maybe overestimate the impact of Twitter on revolutions, but I think sometimes folks in the security sectors in the Middle East underestimate it. And so I would agree. I think they may try to use this for leverage to get some things, but I see this almost, and maybe I'm a little bit more optimistic here because we were pessimistic when we wrote the report, but I see this almost a desperation move of the military thought they were running out of time. It was about to transition to the civilians, and this was the only thing they could think of to do to try to, in many cases, save their necks because they're about to be investigated. In terms of next steps, we had a couple, and so let me take them in order of not necessarily least to greatest, but maybe easiest to hardest lifts. One, at the education point, I want to just circle back to something Mohi said. It's extremely important. You shape the minds of the kids, you shape the future in a lot of ways. And so that's a huge aspect of this for religious freedom. Another thing that we found that was very interesting was Nuba Mountains is a fascinating area. And so you have an area that is mixed Christian, mixed Muslim, very pluralistic, very religiously pluralistic. When the churches got bombed in Nuba, the people in the Muslim villages were helping the Christians rebuild. And there's all kinds of stories like that throughout Nuba. It kind of reminds me of Iraqi Kurdistan in some ways, in the way that pluralism has developed there. So, for egghead academics like myself, an area of further research. Why do we see pluralism in these areas, and can it be replicated? That would be something I think that would be very interesting for religious freedom promotion, both in Sudan and abroad, because if you have a cultural pluralism, sometimes the legal stuff will follow. The most important factor that we identified, and the one that I would stand behind as sort of, this is the thing that will determine whether religious freedom stands or falls, is security sector reform. And by that, I don't necessarily just mean finding a couple of people who, finding a couple of folks at the top and prosecuting them and bringing them to justice. That's important. But what we're talking about here is actually a systemic, meaningful change to the culture and institutions of the military that is going to break the cycle that we've seen since Sudanese independence of coup upon coup upon coup. And that means you have to inculcate a culture of respect for civilian control over the military. And you have to also have a military that reflects the ethnic and religious pluralism of the country, so that you can't have what happened when the Bashir regime came to power, a clique of Islamist officers from a specific region, from a specific part of the country, who can, by gaining control of key posts in the military, launch a coup, take over the government, and overthrow things. So that is hugely important. And I think you can even see that in our own history as Americans. I would argue, to go brief digression, I would argue that we don't get our wonderful Constitution and Bill of Rights and all of that in 1789 and 1790 if we don't have first General George Washington in 1783, when he was a general, talking members of the Continental Army out of their attempt to overthrow the Continental Congress, and then walking to Philadelphia and resigning his commission, because that sets a precedent about civilian control of the military that has not, and God willing, never will be violated in the United States. And you're not going to get a Washington, but you need to build that culture, because my read on it is, and this is something that I would strongly encourage us as we think about religious freedom in Sudan, but around the world, we can do all of the legal stuff. We can do amazing changes to law. We can write the best constitutions. We can do all of these things. But if we don't have that buy-in from people in the security sector, that they are actually committed to this, and they have a culture that respects religious freedom, religious pluralism, and civilian control, it's going to be really, really hard to make it stand up when things get difficult and some of these guys see the opportunity to maybe take power. So I would really emphasize, I think that long-term, sustainable, systemic reform of the security sector is the most important factor in Sudan. And if we're talking about U.S. and other external factors, that's really, I think, the number one priority that we have to be focused on.
Thank you. Miriam, coming to you, as you've been a spokesperson and an advocate on so many of the issues that need to be addressed. Yeah, what's the message that you want the world to hear now with regards to Sudan?
Well, thank you. You said a very important point about education and change in culture. Like, when the government announced that they are banning female genital mutilation, it's been there already, even during al-Bashir regime. But I can guarantee you 80% of the villages and small cities around Khartoum, they still doing this practice. They still continuing in this practice because we have people know that's happening in the community, but they can't even report it. They can't even say it. So, and this is would be resolved by education. So if we have enough the curriculum that is explaining this, teaching the young children, young girls, and there's enough resources for them to seek help and support they needed. And for the change on government, or the change in the situation now, I would say it is not impossible to have led civilian government if we apply justice. If those individuals who are, including al-Bashir, he's still being persecuted in Sudan, he's supposed to be handed at least to ICC. If those individuals, those military leaders have seen this happen to al-Bashir or his follower or al-Bashir regime, I believe they won't even think of turning their back to their fellow civilian leader on the transitional government. I think justice is important, and justice needs to be served for people of Sudan, for those who lost their life in this place, in Darfur, in Nuba Mountains. We need to speak about justice. We need to seek justice, and it's so important, not just for the. We're not, as Hamdouk always speak on digging into the past. It's so important to have this done, not just digging into the past, in the clear way moving forward. Because if we have applied justice for those who committed a crime in the watch of the world seen what's happening there for years, and happening in Nuba Mountain, and it's happened in Sudan, and it's happened in the street of Khartoum during the protest in 2019. And we still, it's not about the matter of forgiveness. And as the other thing, also, the first thing the military leader have done, they issues pardon against themselves. Like, they know they are protected. But what they care much about, they protect themselves more than they to protect the citizen of the country of Sudan. So it's very challenging time, yes, but it's not impossible if we put justice first. It is not, and they have all the support they need. The support we need is not to move forward, is to resolve the problem we have in the table. We have issues in the table, we have justice, we have a violation happen for years from al-Bashir regime, but al-Bashir is still in Sudan. He's still treated as a just normal person who, it is not, it's very frustrating situation. And I will see truth coming out, and I hope that the world can see the same thing. And I really hope the world can listen and respect the voice of people in the street. Even now, they're calling this no negotiation, no partnership with the military leader. And this is have to be respected. Really, if there's anything that needs to be fixed moving forward, we need to listen to what the people on the street wanted. Why they are standing on the ground, that crying out the one word that they want civilian-led government. The justice, we can have that if we apply justice, and we have all the tools, we have all the support. Even Hamdouk himself, he lost the chance, and I don't believe, I don't think he would be the good choice to lead the government, to lead the country in the future. Even though we're supposed to wait for many things that's been done, including removing Sudan from the terrorist list, we're supposed at least to wait after we have fair election, and we have government, civilian-led government on the power. Because when the world see what's happening in the street now, we many cases, a lot had happened is avoidable.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so much work still to be done, and hearing the voice of the people, I think that's a message that's come through very clearly. And that a system that will deliver justice for all the people of Sudan. I appreciate Ismail, your comment of a revolution of consciousness that's awakening and saying these issues must be dealt with. We're coming up just to the end of our time, but wanted to give to each of you one last chance for a parting word as we wrap up the time. So we'll go in order as we are on the screen. But Ismail, yeah, and a closing thought from you as we wrap up this time.
Modern history since independence in '56. It's been this vicious cycle of civilian rule followed by a coup, followed by a popular uprising. That has happened 3 times in Sudanese history, modern history. For many, this third revolution, hopefully, is the charm. I still think that the final word on this transition is not yet has not yet been made. We'll see in the coming days, but I think the most the thing to keep the eye on is the prize of transferring Sudan into a situation that allows Sudanese to discuss their problems, to discuss their issues non-violently and peacefully, to transfer truly into a democracy. Any promises that the military may often, whether it be economic, social, or political, domestically, or even regionally or internationally, that does not see the full process of Sudan's democratization, I think would be problematic. Partial solutions to Sudan's challenges, I think, should be rejected domestically and internationally. Sudan has come a long way to where it is now, and hopefully we'll see steps that will allow for Sudanese to continue on the path of democracy.
Thank you. Yeah, Mohi.
I echo what Ismail said. I totally agree that my own reflection is that I think Sudan had reached a point where I don't think any type of government could succeed unless it's a democratic government. It is at a point where the majority, if not all of Sudanese people, are determined to be seen and reflected in the government. And it's at a point where the military in itself cannot really, it doesn't matter how much force they use. I don't think they will be able to squash the dreams of 40 million Sudanese who are on the streets wanting a different situation and wanting a better future. And I would conclude and say that I think ultimately it's good, not just for the military, but even for the military leadership to kind of play a positive role in charting a Sudan that is more inclusive and more reflective of its people.
Thank you. AJ.
Yeah, I just would agree with what Ismail and Mohi said. When we were writing the report, I think there were real concerns that something like this would happen. But now looking at what happened, the sense that I sort of get is the military shot their shot. This was the best opportunity, I guess, that they felt they had in terms of, seizing control back and sort of maintaining that position of power and control and, preventing sort of the investigation of justice. And it's not going the way they hoped. It doesn't seem like they're getting the international backing from regional players they were hoping to get. There certainly has been a huge backlash from the people. It's, I would concur. I don't think they can put it down at this point. And so, I cautiously optimistic that what we will ultimately see is a return to civilian control, and then then you have the hard part, right? So, getting things back on track is I think the way things are going. But then we start to get into that question of transforming culture, transforming the culture of the military, transforming the culture of the people. Some of the changes that Miriam was talking about, even in, getting the idea of religious freedom out to the villages. That is a long, hard process, an important process. And I think, the main thing is just for people to recognize that even if the coup is reversed, which I think we all sort of think it will be, that is not the end. It may be the end of the beginning of the process of bringing real religious freedom to Sudan.
Thank you. And Miriam.
Thank you. I think Sudan is very special country. It's a very good example when people get out in the street. They set an example and give the world hope that change can happen, and it's end 30 years of dictatorship regime or al-Bashir regime. So this is big step, and hearing the voice of people, it's very important at this time in any decision making for any international community, from the civilian leaders. I think, and there's no any other chance, as you guys discussed, there's no chance that people will accept military leadership or military government in the country anymore. So my hope that things will go the way the people really want it, because it's been very long journey for people from war, conflicts, and living under oppression and persecution, even during al-Bashir regime, not just the Christian, not just the religious minority. There's no free speech, there's no any human rights or dignity or respect to individuals who, like the freedom loving Muslims. It's very hard and challenging time. So we want to see better for our country. And we want to be able, I am one of the people who are invited to go back to Sudan. So I don't know if I listened to that and I went back, what would happen. We want to see our country really doing better and becoming a better, safe place and safe haven, not just for Sudanese people, even for others that who are struggling. Because in many other countries, in African countries or Middle East, when it is a conflict and there's issues, Sudan welcome huge amount of immigrants into the country. So that's how it's important to have peace and security in Sudan.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and an important symbol, and more than a symbol, a reality. Well, thank you so much, Miriam, AJ, Mohi, and Ismail for joining us. The message that came through is a government and a culture that delivers dignity, equality, justice for all of its people. That's what we hope will be the reality in Sudan. That's very much the work that RFI is about. We aim to advance religious freedom for everyone, everywhere. So thank you for joining for this conversation. A privilege to have it, to see more conversations like this, to learn more about the work of RFI. Visit our website at rfi.org. Thanks to each of our speakers for joining us, and we look forward to future events. Thank you.